An Introduction to the Study of the Kabalah by Wynn Westcott. Preface. Students of literature, philosophy, and religion who possess any affinity for the occult sciences may profitably direct their attention to the Kabalah of the ancient Hebrew rabbis. For irrespective of the inquirer's personal faith, they will not only acquire knowledge but will also expand their perspective on life and destiny by comparing alternative religious systems with the doctrines in which they were nurtured, or which they embraced upon attaining maturity and intellectual discretion. Being thoroughly convinced of the benefits to be derived from such an inquiry, I wish to direct attention to the dogmas of the ancient Hebrew Kabalah. It was my fortunate privilege to be drawn to this somewhat recondite study during my youth, and in subsequent years I have succeeded in dedicating some leisure to acquiring a comprehension of this Hebrew religious philosophy. My understanding of the subject has been further augmented by my membership in the Rosicrucian Society. Nevertheless, the Kabbalistic treatises are so voluminous and numerous, and so great a portion of them can only be studied in Rabbinic Hebrew and Chaldean, that I feel less secure in my knowledge of the Kabalah today than I did 2 decades ago, when this essay was first published, following its delivery as a series of lectures to a society of Hermetic students in 1888. Since that period, a French translation of the Zohar by Jean de Pauli, as well as a volume entitled The Literature and History of the Kabalah by Arthur E. Waite, have been published. Nonetheless, I believe this modest treatise will remain of interest to those who lack the requisite leisure to master the more comprehensive works on the subject. Reference to the Old Testament has been unavoidable, but I have intentionally omitted any allusion to the New Testament or to the doctrines and faith taught by Jesus the Christ as the Savior of the world. Should any reader wish to investigate the purported allusion in the Kabalah to the Trinity, it may be found in the Zohar, Volume 2, Section 43, and an English translation of this passage is available in the Kabalah by C.D. Ginsburg. Wynn Westcott. Chapter 1. The Kabalah. It must be acknowledged that the origin of the Kabalah is obscured by the mists of antiquity. None can definitively demonstrate who its author was, or identify its earliest exponents. Substantial evidence may be adduced to suggest that its origins extend back to the Hebrew rabbis who flourished during the epoch of the Second Temple, approximately 515 BC. Of its existence prior to that era, I am aware of no historical proof. It has been posited that the Babylonian captivity of the Jews facilitated the development of this philosophy through the influence of Chaldean lore and dogma upon Jewish tradition. In the earliest stages of its evolution, the doctrine was undoubtedly entirely oral, hence the term Kabalah, derived from Kabalah meaning to receive, and it was inevitably modified by the diverse minds through which it filtered. There exists no evidence that any portion of it was committed to writing for several centuries thereafter. It has remained singularly distinct both from the exoteric Mosaic books of the Pentateuch and from the continually expanding commentaries thereon, namely the Mishnah and Gemara, which constitute the Talmud. The latter appears to have developed within Hebrew theology without merging with the recondite doctrines of the Kabalah. Analogously, we observe in India that the Upanishads, an esoteric series of treatises, developed alongside the Brahmanas and the Puranas, which are exoteric instructions intended for the general populace. Regarding the most ancient Kabbalistic treatises still extant, a vehement controversy has persisted among modern critics, who dispute the attributed era of each work and attempt to demonstrate that the purported author is precisely the individual who could not have composed the text in question. Yet these critics display the greatest divergence of opinion the moment they are required to determine a specific date or author, illustrating how much simpler destructive criticism is than the acquisition of genuine knowledge. Let us briefly examine the principal ancient Kabbalistic treatises. The Sefer Yetzirah, or Book of Formation, is the oldest among them and is traditionally attributed to the patriarch Abraham. Several editions of an English translation prepared by myself have been published. This work delineates a highly singular philosophical system of creation, drawing an analogy between the origin of the cosmos, the sun, the planets, the elements, the seasons, humanity, and the 22 letters of the Hebrew alphabet. It categorizes these letters into a triad, a heptad, and a dodecad. The three mother letters, Aleph, Mem, and Shin, correspond to primeval air, water, and fire. The 7 double letters correspond to the planets and the sevenfold division of time. And the 12 simple letters relate to the months, the signs of the zodiac, and the organs of the human body. Modern criticism generally concludes that the surviving ancient versions were compiled circa 200 AD. The Sefer Yetzirah is mentioned in both the Jerusalem and Babylonian Talmuds and was composed in the Neo-Hebraic tongue, similar to the Mishnah. The Zohar or Sohar, rendered in Hebrew as Zohar, signifying the book of splendor or of light, is a compilation of numerous distinct treatises concerning the deity, angelic beings, human souls, and cosmogony. Its authorship is attributed to Rabbi Simon ben Jokai, who lived circa 160 AD and was persecuted and forced to seek refuge in a cave by Lucius Aurelius Verus, co-regent with the Emperor Marcus Aurelius Antoninus. A substantial portion of the work may have been compiled by him from the oral traditions of his era, but other sections were undoubtedly appended by different hands at various intervals until the work was first published in its entirety by Rabbi Moses de Leon of Guadalajara, Spain, circa 1290. Subsequent to that period, its history is well documented. Printed editions were issued in Mantua, 1558, Cremona, 1560, and Lublin, 1623. Which constitute the 3 celebrated codices of the Zohar in the Hebrew tongue. For those unable to read Hebrew, the only practical means of studying the Zohar are the partial Latin translation by Baron Nor von Rosenroth, published in 1684 under the title Kabalah Denudata, and the English edition of 3 treatises, namely the Sifrad Seniautha or Book of Concealed Mystery, the Ha-Idra Rabbah or Greater Assembly, and the Ha-Idra Sutta or Lesser Assembly, translated by Samuel Liddell MacGregor Mathers. While these 3 books convey a reasonable impression of the tone, style, and content of the Zohar, they offer only a partial perspective. Other tracts within the Zohar include the Haikaloth, the Palaces, the Siddur Torah, Mysteries of the Law, the Midrash HaNelim, the Secret Commentary, the Raja Mehemna, the Faithful Shepherd, the Saba Demishpatim, the Discourse of the Aged, the Prophet Elias, and the Januka, the Young Man, accompanied by glosses designated as Tosefta and Methanathan. Currently in the course of publication is a highly scholarly French translation of the Complete Zohar by Jean de Pauli. Other celebrated Kabbalistic treatises include the commentary on the 10 Sephiroth by Rabbi Azariel ben Munakim, circa 1200 AD, the Alphabet of Rabbi Akiba, the Gate of Heaven, the Book of Enoch, the Pardes Rimonim, Garden of Pomegranates, a treatise on the emanations, the Otz HaChim, the Tree of Life, by Chajim Vital, the Rashith HaGalgulim, Revolutions of Souls, by Isaac de Loria, and especially the writings of the eminent Spanish Jew Ibn Jebral, who died circa 1070 AD and was also known as Avisprin, whose major works are the Fountain of Life and the Crown of the Kingdom. The doctrines of the Kabalah are generally regarded as having been divided into several schools of thought, each of which enjoyed temporary renown. Among these may be mentioned the School of Gerona 1190 to 1210, associated with Rabbi Isaac the Blind, Rabbis Azariel and Ezra, and Moses Nachmanides. The School of Segovia, comprising Rabbis Jacob, Abulafia, Shem Tab, and Isaac of Akko. The School of Rabbi Isaac ben Abraham ibn Latif, circa 1390. And the School of Abulafia and Joseph Jacatilla. Additionally, there are the schools of the Zoharists, represented by Rabbis Moses de Leon, Menahem D. Rekanati, Isaac Loria, and Chajim Vital, the last of whom died in 1620. A highly distinguished German Kabbalist was John Reuchlin, also known as Capnio, who authored two monumental works, De Verbo Mirifico and De Arte Kabbalistica. In the main, there existed two distinct tendencies among the Kabbalists. The one school devoted themselves entirely to the doctrinal and dogmatic branch, while the other dedicated themselves to the practical and wonder-working aspect. The most eminent of these wonder-working rabbis were Isaac Loria, also designated as Ari, and Sabbatai Zevi, who, curiously enough, eventually embraced Mohammedanism. Both of these departments of occult rabbinic lore retain their living representatives, who are chiefly scattered individuals, for it is only on rare occasions that organized groups of initiates are encountered. Within Central Europe, as well as portions of Russia, Austria, and Poland, there exist even today certain Jews, known as wonder-working rabbis, who perform extraordinary feats which they attribute to the Kabalah. Furthermore, phenomena exceedingly difficult to explain have been witnessed in England, wrought by students of Kabbalistic rites and talismans. The rabbinic commentaries, comprising numerous successive series overlaying one another, which currently exist in connection with the ancient treatises, constitute so vast a mass of Kabbalistic lore as to render the task of comprehending them almost impossible. Indeed, it is probable that no Christian or Jew within this country can confidently state what doctrines do not still lie concealed within some of these ancient manuscript works. The dogmatic or theoretical Kabbalah expounds philosophical conceptions regarding the deity, angels, and celestial beings more spiritual than man, as well as the human soul and its diverse aspects or constituent parts, alongside doctrines concerning pre-existence, reincarnation, and the various worlds or planes of existence. The practical Kabbalah, on the other hand, attempts a mystical and allegorical interpretation of the Old Testament, scrutinizing every phrase, word, and letter. It teaches the correspondence between letters and numbers, the modes of their interrelation, and the principles of gematria, notarikon, and temura. Furthermore, it details the formation and employment of divine and angelic names as amulets, the construction of magic squares, and a vast repository of allied, curious lore that subsequently served as the foundation of medieval magic. For those who do not desire to read any Kabbalistic treatise in its entirety, but prefer instead to glean a general overview of this philosophy, there are currently 3 standard works available. 2 of these are in English, one by Dr. C. Ginsberg, published in 1865, which offers a formal and concise resume of the doctrines. The other, an excellent volume entitled The Doctrine and Literature of the Kabalah, by Arthur Edward Waite, published in 1902. The third, written in French by Adolphe Frank in 1889, is more discursive and presents fewer specific details. Many points in the teachings of Indian systems of religious philosophy are not addressed by the Hebrew system, or are otherwise excluded by differences of a fundamental nature, such as the cosmogony of other worlds, unless the destroyed worlds of unbalanced force refer to these. Moreover, the inviolability of cosmic law, such as karma, is not a prominent feature, and while reincarnation is indeed taught, the number of rebirths is generally limited to 3. A minor portion of Kabbalistic doctrine may be found within the Jewish Talmud. However, that collection of treatises contains certain coarser elements that are entirely absent from the true Kabalah, such as the theories concerning the debasement of human souls into animal forms, or the rebirth of men as women as a punishment for transgressions committed in a prior earthly life. It must be remembered that many doctrinal points are restricted to the teachings of only a few rabbis, and that the discrepancies between the earliest and latest doctrines on any given subject are sometimes exceedingly vast, as is demonstrated by a comparison of the books composed by rabbis of differing eras and schools. Furthermore, some portion of the Kabbalistic teachings has never been printed or published, having been transmitted even to this day solely from master to disciple. Indeed, there are certain tenets not to be found in any Hebrew volume, which I myself have expounded within the Rosicrucian Society and in Hermetic lodges. An attentive study of some of these ancient, mystical Hebrew volumes discloses the existence of intentional blinds, which appear to have been introduced to restrict certain dogmas to those students deemed fit to receive them, thereby preserving them from indiscriminate dissemination and consequent misuse by the ignorant or the malevolent. 2 or 3 centuries have now elapsed since any significant addition has been made to the body of Kabbalistic doctrine. Prior to that period, however, a long succession of commentaries was produced, all of which served to elucidate or expand the grand philosophical scheme. As previously stated, the precise era in which the Kabalah first assumed shape as a concrete whole and a structured philosophical system may remain forever an unresolved question. Yet, if we regard it, as I believe is correct, as the esotericism of the religion of the Hebrews, its foundational dogmas are undoubtedly almost as ancient as the initial promulgation of the primary tenets of the worship of Jehovah. I cannot at present attempt to examine the contentions of skeptical scholars who question whether the narrative of the 12 tribes constitutes historical fact, or whether there ever existed such figures as Moses or even King Solomon. It is sufficient for our present purpose that the Jewish nation possessed the Jehovistic theology, a structured priestly caste, and a coherent doctrine at the time of the Second Temple, when Cyrus, sovereign of all Asia, in 536 BC, whilst holding the Jews in captivity, permitted a remnant of them to return to Jerusalem for the express purpose of re-establishing the Hebrew mode of worship, which had been forcibly disrupted by Nebuchadnezzar in 587 BC. It was following this return to Jerusalem that Ezra and Nehemiah, circa 450 BC, edited and compiled the Old Testament of the Hebrews, or, according to those scholars who reject both the Mosaic authorship and the historical reality of the Solomonic reign, it was during this epoch that they composed the Pentateuch. This restored worship was maintained until 320 BC, when Jerusalem was captured by Ptolemy Soter, who, nevertheless, did not destroy the foundations of the Jewish religion. Indeed, his successor, Ptolemy Philadelphus, commissioned 72 scholars to revise and translate the Hebrew scriptures into Greek, circa 277 BCA work which has been known for centuries as the Septuagint version of the Old Testament. Further tribulations for the Jewish people ensued, however, and Jerusalem was once more captured and pillaged by Antiochus in 170 BC. There followed the protracted wars of the Maccabees, after which the Romans established dominion over Judea. Subsequently, owing to disputes with the Jewish populace, the city was taken by Pompey and was plundered not long thereafter by the Roman general Crassus in 54 BC. Yet, through all this, the Jewish religion was preserved, and we find its sacred feasts and festivals fully active during the era of Jesus. Nevertheless, once more in 70 AD, the Holy City was captured, ransacked, and burned, on this occasion by Titus, who subsequently ascended the Roman imperial throne in 79 AD. Through all these vicissitudes, the Hebrew Old Testament survived, though it must almost inevitably have undergone numerous alterations and interpolations within its various treatises. Meanwhile, the more esoteric doctrines, which were transmitted along the lineage of the priestly caste and never incorporated into the public Torah, were doubtless repeatedly modified by the influence of contending preceptors. Shortly after this period, there was compiled the earliest series of glosses and commentaries on the books of the Old Testament that have survived to our day. Of these, the earliest comprised the volume known as the Targum of Onkelos on the Law, written circa 100 AD, and that of Jonathan ben Uzziel on the Prophets. Circa 141 AD, the now celebrated treatise compiled by the rabbis of Judah, known as the Mishnah, first came to prominence, forming the foundation of those vast compilations of Hebrew doctrine known as the Talmud, of which two versions are extant, the more notable compiled in Babylon, and the other associated with Jerusalem. To this original Mishnah, the rabbis appended subsequent commentaries designated as the Gemara. From this epoch onward, the literature of Judaism flourished rapidly, and there followed an unbroken succession of eminent Hebrew rabbis who published religious treatises, continuing until at least 1500 AD. The two Talmuds were first committed to print at Venice in the years 1520 and 1523 respectively. The books of the Old Testament served as the guiding light throughout the generations of the Jewish people, but the erudite rabbis were not satisfied with these alone, and they supplemented them by two parallel series of literary works, the one, Talmudic, being commentaries based upon 13 rules of argument delivered by Moses to elucidate the Old Testament, and supply material for instructing the populace, and the other a long series of treatises of a more abstruse character, designed to illustrate their secret doctrines and esoteric views. The Sefer Yetzirah and the Zohar or Book of Splendor represent the core of that oral instruction which the rabbis of antiquity prided themselves upon possessing, and which they have even claimed as being the secret knowledge which God imparted to Moses for the exclusive use of the priesthood, in contradistinction to the written law intended for the masses of the people. One of the primary tenets of the Kabalah is that spiritual wisdom is attained through 32 paths, typified by the 10 numbers and the 22 letters, these 10 being, in turn, symbols of the divine emanations, the Sephiroth, the holy voices chanting at the crystal sea, the great sea, the mother supernal Bina, and of the 22 occult forces inherent in the nature of the universe symbolized by the 3 primary elements, the 7 planets, and the 12 zodiacal influences of the heavens, which tincture human concerns through the transit of our sun in its annual course. I have provided the appellations and definitions of the 32 paths at the conclusion of my edition of the Sefer Yetzirah. Now, to demonstrate the intimate connection between the Kabalah and Orthodox Judaism, we find the rabbis cataloging the books of the Old Testament into a sequence of 22 works to be read for the cultivation of spiritual life. This 22 they derived from the 39 books of the Old Testament canon. By consolidating the 12 minor prophets into a single treatise, Ruth they appended to Judges, Ezra to Nehemiah, while the duplicate books of Samuel, Kings, and Chronicles they designated as single volumes. The canon of 39 works was established during the epoch of Ezra. Returning to the texts that elucidate the Kabalah, irrespective of the authenticity of their purported origins, it remains undeniable that those ancient volumes, the Sefer Yetzirah and Zohar, contain a system of spiritual philosophy of lucid design, profound intuition, and far-reaching cosmological implications, which are eminently worthy of the honor of receiving a distinct appellation and of establishing a theological body of doctrine. The Kabalah, the bulwark and principal foundation of the public Hebrew religion, has ever been the Pentateuch, 5 treatises ascribed to Moses, which promulgate the laws of Jehovah delivered to his chosen people. The Old Testament, beginning with these 5 books, is further continued by historical records, by poetical teachings, and by prophetic works, yet many portions are characterized by materialistic attributes and a deficiency of spiritual rectitude which the scriptures of a great religion might be expected to display, and they even offend our contemporary standards of moral life. The Mosaic Law, eminently valuable for diverse purposes to a small nation 3,000 years ago, and containing numerous regulations of a character demonstrating great attention to sanitary matters, is nevertheless marred by the infliction of penalties of egregious cruelty and the harsh treatment of erring mortals, which are scarcely compatible with our modern conceptions of that which might have emanated from God, the personal creator of this universe with its myriad worlds, and the almost complete absence of any reference to an afterlife for human beings exhibits a materialism that necessitated a new revelation by Jesus, whose life has earned the title of Christ. Yet the Orthodox of England receive this statement with incredulity, and if requested to demonstrate the passages in the Old Testament that insist upon an afterlife, or upon a succession of incarnations for the purpose of retribution, or the passages demonstrating the immortality of the soul, they are unable to produce them, and are content to refer the inquirer to the clergy, whose response typically is, if not explicitly stated, these dogmas are implied. But are they? If they are, how is it that remarkably clear passages can be cited which demonstrate that eminent authors in the Old Testament make assertions in direct opposition to these doctrines? And how is it, again, that a preeminent author of modern times has observed prosperity was the blessing of the Old Testament for good works, but adversity that of the New? This could only be valid if there were no future existence or succession of lives, or no impending epoch of retribution and reward contemplated by the doctrine of the Old Testament. Yet the observation is correct, and the Old Testament does indeed teach that man is no more immortal than the beast, as witness Ecclesiastes 3:19. For that which befalleth the sons of men befalleth beasts, even one thing befalleth them. As the one dieth, so dieth the other. Yea, they have all one breath, so that man hath no preeminence above a beast. For all is vanity. All go unto one place, all are of the dust, and all turn to dust again. Wherefore I perceive that there is nothing better than that a man should rejoice in his own works, for that is his portion. For who shall bring him to see what shall be after him? Who, indeed, save his own ego, soul, or higher self? But perhaps this work is from the pen of some obscure Jew, or semi-pagan Chaldean or Babylonian. Assuredly not. Jewish critics have unanimously ascribed it to Solomon, who was the king of the Jews during the zenith of their glory. Surely if the immortality of the soul were the essence of the popular Jewish faith, Solomon could not have so egregiously denied it. If one reverts, however, to the account of creation in Genesis, the identical narrative is encountered: the animals are formed from the dust, man is formed from the dust, and Eve is formed from Adam, and each has breathed into its form the nefesh chaya, the breath of life, vitality. Yet there is no intimation that Adam received a ray of the supernal mind which was to inhabit that vessel for a season, to acquire experience, to undergo retribution, and subsequently enter another stage of progress and achieve an ultimate return to its divine source. And yet the authors of these volumes, whoever they may have been, could scarcely have been devoid of the conception of the higher aspect of man, of his spiritual soul. The scholarly contention is that the Old Testament was divested at some juncture of its religious philosophy, which was reserved for a privileged class, while the mere husk of rigid law and tradition was alone offered for the acceptance of the populace. The core of spiritual philosophy, which is absent from the Old Testament as a religious text, may indeed be the essential nucleus of the Kabalah, for these Kabbalistic dogmas are Hebraic, and they are spiritual, and they are sublime in their grandeur, and the Old Testament read in their light becomes a work worthy of the acceptance of a nation. I refer to the essentials of the Kabalah, the ancient substratum of the Kabalah. I concede that in many extant treatises these primal truths have been obscured by successive generations of editors, by visionary and frequently unrefined editions, and by the vagaries of Oriental imagery, but the keynotes of a great spiritual divine concealed power, of its emanations in manifestation, of its vitalization of human life, of the post-mortem persistence of human souls, and of the transient state of corporeal existence, are fundamental doctrines therein fully illustrated. And these are the points of contact between the Kabalah of the Jew and the so-called esotericism of the teachings of Buddha and of Hinduism. It may be that the Catholic Church, from which the Protestant Church seceded, was from its inception in possession of the Hebrew rabbinical secret of the intentional exoteric nature of the Bible, and of a sacerdotal method of comprehending the esoteric Kabalah as a key to the true interpretation of the Jewish books, which being ostensibly historical are in reality largely allegorical. Were this premise accepted, it would elucidate why the Roman Catholic Church has for centuries discouraged the laity from examining the books of the Old Testament, and would suggest that Protestantism erred when, alongside the reformation of a corrupt priesthood, it encouraged the laity to read these same scriptures. I observe that the literal interpretation of the Mosaic books, and indeed of the Old Testament as a whole, has repeatedly served to justify deplorable systems of conduct. A striking example of this occurred merely a century ago, when the clergy of Protestant nations almost unanimously defended the continuation of the slave trade, drawing their arguments from the laws of Jehovah, which were asserted to have been binding upon the Jews. The freethinkers of that era were, to a great extent, the champions of suffering and oppressed races. Moreover, for centuries, the wisest of men and the most eminent scientists have maintained, and consistently won, successive conflicts against the presumed infallibility of the literal instructions, assertions, and narratives of the ancient Hebrew Testament. Although the Old Testament may indeed serve, to some degree, as a unifying bond for millions of Christians, given that Jesus the Christ established his doctrine among the Jewish people, the endless array of modern Christian sects has arisen almost entirely from the assertion of the right to personal biblical interpretation. This right might have remained inaccessible to the general populace had there been an acknowledgement that the keys of interpretation were lost, or at least absent, and that without their aid, errors of a fundamental nature were unavoidable. The vast accumulation of disparate biblical interpretations, though foolish, is of minor importance compared to the parallel truth that the adherents of each of these hundreds of sects have arrogated to themselves not only the right of private interpretation, but also the obligation to condemn all others. They act as if the infallibility they attribute to the scriptures must inevitably be reflected in their own personal propaganda or the peculiar dogmas of their respective chapels. Religious intolerance has plagued every village in the country, and scarcely a single sect has arisen that has not claimed not only the right to dissent and criticize, but also to persecute and consign to damnation all who lie outside its own narrow confines. The mystic, the occultist, and the theosophist render a noble service to the divine by elucidating the foundations and origins of all faiths through the mutual light they shed upon one another. While great benefit may accrue from tolerance and mutual respect, the internecine struggles of religious adherents damage every faith. Under such conditions, religion becomes synonymous with intolerance, discord, and vanity, and the defining characteristic of a zealous sectarian is now a perpetual readiness to condemn the endeavors of others, in direct defiance of the precept of Jesus the Christ, who declared, "Judge not, that ye be not judged." One Jewish sect, the Karaites, successors to the Sadducees, has throughout history rejected the Kabalah, and it is requisite to state here that the contemporary Hebrew rabbis of this country do not practice the practical Kabalah, nor do they endorse all the tenets of the dogmatic Kabalah. Conversely, numerous distinguished Christian scholars have expressed profound affinity for the doctrinal Kabalah. Saint Jerome, who passed away in 420 AD, presents in his letter to Marcella all the Kabbalistic divine names associated with the 10 Sephiroth. Other prominent figures include Raymond Lully, 1315, Pope Sixtus IV, 1484, Pico della Mirandola, 1494, Johannes Reuchlin, 1522, Heinrich Cornelius Agrippa, 1535, Jerome Cardan, 1576, Guillaume Postel, 1581, John Pistorius, 1608, Jacob Boehme, 1624, the eminent English Rosicrucian, Robert Flood, 1637, Henry Moore, 1687, the celebrated Jesuit Athanasius Kircher, 1680, and Nor von Rosenroth, 1689. To this number must be added Eliphas Levi and Edouard Schur, two modern French writers on the occult sciences, as well as two English authors, Anna Kingsford and Edward Maitland. The illustrious German philosopher Spinoza, 1677, likewise held the doctrines of the Kabalah in high regard. Chapter 2. The Practical Kabalah. Let us examine the practical Kabalah prior to the dogmatic. It may, perhaps, have preceded the theoretical philosophy, as it was initially concerned with a meticulous study of the Pentateuch, an investigation predicated on the premise that every sentence, word, and letter was of divine inspiration, and that not a single jot or tittle could be disregarded. The rabbis enumerated every word and letter. Since their numerical values were represented by their letters, they calculated the numerical value of all divine names and titles, of all proper nouns, and of the phrases documenting divine injunctions. There were also several final letters: the final Kaf, 500, the final Mem, 600, the final Nun, 700, the final P, 800, and the final Tzada, 900. It should be observed that the divine name Jah possessed a numerical value of 15, and consequently, in ordinary practice, the number 15 was invariably represented by 9 and 6, using Taith and Vav. The Kabbalistic rabbis acknowledged the literal significance of the words of the Torah, or books of the law within the Old Testament, as a guide for ethical conduct in life and as appropriate readings for both the synagogue and the home. Nevertheless, they asserted that every verse, narrative, law, and incident also possessed a deeper, concealed significance of a mystical nature. This hidden meaning was to be discovered through their calculations, conversions, and substitutions, in accordance with their rules of gematria, Notarikon, and Temura. The first term is of Greek origin, the second is derived from Latin, but the third was Hebrew and signified permutation, Temura, from the root more, to change. The most celebrated 17th-century rabbi, Manasseh ben Israel, compared the books of Moses to the human body, the commentaries known as the Mishnah to the soul, and the Kabalah to the spirit of the soul. Ignorant persons may study the first, the learned the second, but the wisest direct their contemplation to the third. He designated the Kabbalists as divine theologians, endowed with 13 rules enabling them to penetrate the mysteries with which the scriptures abound. Many Kabbalists asserted that their doctrines and methodologies were delivered from heaven by angels to primeval man, and they unanimously believed that the first 4 books of the Pentateuch enshrined their distinctive doctrines, in addition to narrating historical events and establishing laws. The Zohar states, "If these books of the Torah contain only the narratives and words of Esau, Hagar, Laban, and Balaam, why are they designated? The perfect law, the law of truth, the true witness of God. There must be a hidden significance. Woe to the individual who asserts that the law, the Torah, contains merely mundane discourse and fables. If this were true, we might, even in our own time, compile a doctrinal work of greater merit. No, every word possesses a sublime meaning and constitutes a celestial mystery. The law resembles an angel. To descend to the earth, a spiritual angel must don a garment to be recognized or understood in this realm. Similarly, the law was obliged to clothe itself in a garment of words to serve as a body for mankind to receive. Yet the wise look beneath these garments. At various times, both the common Jew and indeed certain Christian fathers have made comparable declarations regarding the literal and mystical senses of Scripture. The Talmud, in the treatise Sanhedrin, notes that Manasseh, king of Israel, questioned whether Moses could not have related matters of greater import than stories concerning the concubine Timnah or Rachel and her mandrakes, to which he received the reply that a concealed meaning resides within these accounts. The Christian father Origen, in his homilies, wrote that all should regard these narratives, such as the creation of the world in 6 days and the planting of trees by the divine, as allegories beneath which a profound, recondite meaning is concealed. Origen posited a 3-fold interpretation: somatic, psychic, and pneumatic, or the body of Scripture, its soul, and its spirit. Nicholas de Lyra, who passed away in 1340, recognized 4 modes of biblical interpretation: the literal, the allegorical, the moral, and the anagogical or mystical. In this methodology, he closely mirrors the schema of the Zohar, wherein a celebrated parable likens the sacred law to a maiden in love who reveals herself to her beloved, first through subtle signs, ramas, then by whispered words, dirush, thereafter by conversing with a veiled face, Haggadah, and finally, she unveils her countenance to disclose the entirety of her affection, this being sod, an intimate communion in secret, a divine mystery. The late Dr. Anna Kingsford and Edward Maitland were eminent Kabbalists who consistently maintained that profound, concealed meanings underlay the literal sense of the ancient Hebrew scriptures. Similarly, the late Helena Blavatsky asserted that the genuinely primordial texts of ancient religions were susceptible to interpretation upon 7 distinct planes of thought. The Kabbalists discerned profound significance within every Hebrew letter, including both standard and final forms, discovering esoteric secrets in enlarged characters, transposed letters, and orthographical anomalies. Historically, they symbolized the divine by the letters Aleph, Yod, or Shin, or represented him by a single point, a point within a circle, a triangle, or even a decad composed of 10 yods. Gematria constitutes a method of hermeneutics whereby a name or word possessing a specific numerical value is deemed to be intrinsically related to other terms sharing that identical sum. Consequently, particular numbers came to represent various concepts and were regarded as mutually interpretive. For instance, the Hebrew spelling of Messiah yields the number 358, which is identical to the numerical value of the phrase Iba Shalach, Shiloh shall come. Hence, the passage in Genesis 49, verses 5 to 10, was interpreted as a messianic prophecy. It is noteworthy that Nachash, the serpent of Moses, also evaluates to 358. Similarly, the letter Shin, valued at 300, became an emblem of divinity due to its numerical equivalence with Ruach Elohim, the Spirit of the living God. Notaricon, or the art of abbreviation, exists in two primary forms. Either a single word is constructed from the initial or final letters of several words, or the individual letters of a single name are expanded to serve as the initials or finals of words comprising an entire sentence. For example, in Deuteronomy 30, verses 5 to 12, Moses inquires, "Who shall go up for us to heaven?" The initial letters of the Hebrew words in this query form the word Milah, which signifies circumcision, whilst the final letters constitute the tetragrammaton Yod-He-Vav-He, the name Jehovah. Hence, it was inferred that circumcision was an essential element of the path leading to God in heaven. Similarly, the word Amen is derived from the initials of Adonai Melech Naaman, the Lord and faithful King, and the renowned rabbinic word of power employed upon talismans, Agla, is composed of the initials of the phrase Atei Jibber Leolam Adonai, the Lord ever powerful, or Thou art powerful forever, O Lord. Tamura represents a more intricate system, which has given rise to a vast array of curious divinatory practices. Under this method, the letters of a word are transposed according to specific rules and within defined constraints. Alternatively, the letters of a word are substituted with other characters based on a systematic scheme, frequently illustrated by a diagram. For instance, a common practice involved writing the first half of the alphabet above the second half in reverse order. Thus, the first letter Aleph was replaced by the final letter Tav, the second, Bet, by Shin, and so forth. By this method, the word Shishak in Jeremiah 25:26 is understood to signify Babel, a permutation designated as Atbash. Utilizing this principle, there exist 21 other potential variations, sequentially named Albit, Abgit, Agdat, and so on, the complete system being termed the combinations of Tsiraf. Additional variations included rational, right, averse, and irregular permutations, derived from a grid of 22 spaces in each direction, comprising 484 minor squares, wherein letters were placed sequentially in vertical columns and subsequently read horizontally, diagonally, or in other directions. To this category belongs the so-called Kabalah of 9 chambers utilized by Mark Master Masons. A further development within these numerical arts is demonstrated by the methods of contraction and extension. For instance, the name Jehovah, summing to 26, was extended by writing out the names of its constituent letters, Yod, He, Vav, He, whereby the values 10, 5, 6, and 5, totaling 26, became 20, 6, 12, and 6, resulting in a new sum of 44. Through another form of extension, Zain 7 was expanded to the sum of the numbers from 1 to 7, yielding 28, which was subsequently reduced to 2 and 8, or 10. Similarly, the tetragrammaton, Jehovah 26, was occasionally reduced to 2 and 6, yielding 8. In like manner, El Shaddai, God Almighty, composed of letters valued at 1, 30, 300, 4, and 10, totaled 345, which was reduced to 12, and ultimately to 3, symbolizing a trinity. A curious concept involved the alteration in the orthography of the names of Abraham and Sarah. Originally styled Abram and Sarai, they were respectively 190 years of age and sterile. Because the letter he was regarded as possessing a fertile quality, it was appended to the name Abram, whilst the Yod in Sarai was transformed into a he, thus establishing their new names. Within the ancient Seper Yetzirah, one finds the attribution of Hebrew letters to the planets. From this foundation arose a system for designing talismans, which were either inscribed upon parchment or engraved upon brass and gemstones. Since each planet was associated with a specific letter and number, a corresponding magic square composed of smaller subdivisions was allocated to each. For example, Jupiter was assigned the number 4 and the letter Daleth, and its magic square comprised 16 smaller units containing the numbers 1 through 16, wherein every row summed to 34, and the grand total of the numbers was 136. Every properly consecrated talisman bore at least one divine name to sanctify it. Prominent among these names were Jah, Eloah, and the tetragrammaton Yod-He-Vav-He, alongside the illustrious 42-lettered name, which was constructed from other divine appellations, such as Al, Elohim, Jehovah, Sabaoth, El-Chai, and Adonai. The Shem-Ham-Pharash, or separated name, was a celebrated word of power consisting of 3 times 72 letters, derived from verses 19, 20, and 21 of Exodus 14. The individual letters of verse 19 were transcribed sequentially, followed by those of verse 20 in reverse order, and those of verse 21 in direct order. This arrangement yielded 72 names of 3 letters each when read vertically. To each of these triliteral names, the suffixes El or Jah were appended, thereby generating the names of the 72 angels of Jacob's ladder, which spans from earth to heaven. These angelic names were frequently inscribed upon the obverse and reverse of metallic metals or parchment scrolls to create 36 distinct talismans. According to certain Kabbalists, both King David and King Solomon were capable of performing wonders through the application of Kabbalistic magical arts. The pentagram was designated the Seal of Solomon, whilst the hexagram was styled the Shield of David. To the vertices of the former were assigned the spirit and the 4 elements, whereas to those of the latter were attributed the planets. The treatise entitled The Clavicules of King Solomon is, undoubtedly, a medieval fabrication. Furthermore, the letters of the Hebrew alphabet are associated with the 22 major arcana or trump cards of the tarot deck, which have been widely utilized for divinatory purposes. The Romani of southern Europe employ these cards for fortune-telling. The French scholar Court de Gebelin asserted that these trump cards, as mystical emblems, originated from the magic of ancient Egypt. Occult science assigns to each card a specific number, a letter, and a corresponding natural force or astronomical body, such as the planets, zodiacal signs, and elements. Reference may be made to the Sanctum Regnum of the Tarot Trumps, which I have edited. Dr. Incos of Paris, writing under the pseudonym of Papoose, has likewise published a treatise on the tarot, offering a Kabbalistic attribution of the trump cards that Rosicrucians deem erroneous. To the best of my knowledge, the practice of the Kabalah as a magical art is currently restricted almost exclusively to Russian and Polish rabbis, alongside a small number of occult students in this country, some of whom habitually wear Kabbalistic talismans despite their Christian faith. Chapter 3. The Dogmatic Kabalah. The primary doctrines of the theoretical Kabalah, as Ginsburg observes, are principally formulated to address the mysteries surrounding the nature of the Supreme Being, the creation of the cosmos and of our earthly sphere, the creation of angels and humanity, the ultimate destiny of the world and mankind, and the true significance of the revealed law. The Kabalah validates the following assertions of the Old Testament: the absolute unity of God, His incorporeal nature, eternity, immutability, perfection, and supreme goodness, the genesis of the universe through divine will, the governance of the cosmos, and the creation of humanity in the image of the divine. This system endeavors to elucidate, through the doctrine of emanations, the transition from the infinite to the finite, the emergence of a multiplicity of forms from a singular unity, the generation of matter from spiritual intelligence, and the intricate relations subsisting between creator and creature. Within this theosophical framework, wherein nothing comes from nothing, spirit and matter constitute the antithetical poles of a unitary existence. And just as nothing is created from nothingness, so too is nothing ever utterly annihilated. The following 7 Kabbalistic tenets possess the profoundest interest for scholars investigating the origin and destiny of the cosmos and humanity. First, that God, the Holy One, the supreme and incomprehensible being, the Ein Sof, analogous to the Greek apeiros, was not the immediate creator of the world, but rather that all existence has emanated from the primordial source in successive stages, each less perfect than its predecessor, such that the universe represents God manifest, and the final, most distant product is physical matter, which is characterized by a privation of perfection. Second, that everything we perceive or comprehend is structured according to the Sephirotic archetype. Third, that human souls pre-existed in a celestial realm prior to the genesis of this temporal world. Fourth, that prior to incarnation, human souls reside within a supernal hall or treasury, wherein it is decreed which earthly vessel each soul or ego shall inhabit. Fifth, that every soul, following its earthly existence or existences, must ultimately achieve such purification as to be reabsorbed into the infinite deity. Sixth, that a single human lifespan is rarely sufficient, rendering at least 2 earthly incarnations necessary for almost all souls. Should failure occur during the second life, a third incarnation is undertaken, wherein the soul is bound to a stronger spirit that elevates the transgressor toward purity, this being a variant of the doctrine of reincarnation, the transmigration of souls, or metempsychosis. Seventh, that when all pre-existing souls destined for earthly incarnation have attained perfection, even the fallen angels shall be elevated, and all existence will merge into the deity through the kiss of love from the mouth of the Holy One, whereupon the manifested universe shall cease to exist, until such time as it is once more vivified by the divine fiat. Certain erudite scholars have suggested that these Kabbalistic concepts mirror the philosophies of Alexandria and the Gnostics, incorporating notions derived from the Pythagoreans, the Platonists, as well as Indian Brahmanism and Buddhism. Let us examine more thoroughly the various conceptions of the divinity. Isaac Meyer observes that God may be contemplated from 4 distinct perspectives: as the Eternal One, or Ein Sof; as a High, meaning I am; as Yod He Vav He, signifying He who was, is, and shall be; and as Elohim, God immanent in nature, also designated as Adonai or Lord. Within the English translation of the Old Testament, the name Yod He Vav He is rendered as Lord, while Elohim is translated as God. Boutel asserts that Jah is a contraction of Jehovah. However, the Jehovah of the Old Testament, conceived as a tribal deity possessing anthropomorphic characteristics, displaying his power and glory exclusively to a chosen people, subjugating other nations to serve them, and selecting as his emissaries individuals whom modern civilization would deem unworthy of spiritual authority, finds no place in the Hebrew secret doctrine. To be sure, the Kabalah is replete with references to Jehovah, Yod He Vav He, the divine 4-lettered name or tetragrammaton. Yet here it represents a collective designation for a series of divine conceptions, emanations originating from a central spiritual light whose absolute existence is merely postulated. From the absolute Godhead, a succession of descents occurs, culminating in Jehovah, who constitutes the divine manifestation of Bina, the supernal mother. Subsequent stages of emanation lead to the Elohim, the assembly of holy spiritual attributes associated with the sixth Sephirah, the son of Tifereth. Viewed differently, Jehovah represents the collective emanations from the deific source, known as the 10 Sephiroth, or the celestial voices. These 10 Sephiroth, the first of which... Do you want access to this and all the complete audiobooks on the channel, plus the ebook version? Click the link in the description or scan the QR code in the left corner of the screen to access our library, where you can listen to your favorite esoteric books without ad interruptions, lock your screen, or use other apps while the narration plays, and even download the ebook version to follow along as you listen. Listen on your computer via web browser, or download the app from the Play Store. After subscribing, you will receive an email with your login details, password, and step-by-step instructions on how to access the books through the Hotmart app.